Now, you may remember, for those of you, if you hear me mention, being interested in protest and interested in Russia, you may remember the 2011 protests following the 2011 Duma elections. And for the first time, as I mentioned before, I had gotten interested in the colored revolutions that had taken place in the former Soviet Union and East Central Europe. One of the things you heard over and over again when you were on panels having to do with the colored revolutions was how this was not going to happen in Russia, that Russia was prepared. We were never going to see protests break out following an election with claims of electoral fraud. And then we woke up on one day in 2011 and we saw tens of thousands and then possibly even hundreds of thousands of people coming onto the streets of Moscow to do exactly what everyone had said they weren't going to do, which was protest electoral fraud in Russia. So I began asking around a lot of people what was happening in this regard, and one of the things I kept hearing about was the role of Facebook in organizing these protests and social media generally in terms of that. And that got me thinking, along with some other things that were happening in my career at that time, that as someone who studied mass political behavior, was interested in how citizens participated in politics, I was going to begin to need to know something about social media. That if social media was having an impact on how people participated in politics, if I was leaving this out of my research, eventually what I was going to end up with models that would be missing variables, missing important things. In political science, we'll call this omitted variable bias. It would actually introduce bias into your analysis. And so I started to get very interested in social media. And so with a number of colleagues here at NYU, I formed something called the Social Media and Political Participation Lab, or we call it the SMAP Lab, which does three things. It supports research on social media's impact on politics. It supports research on how we could use social media data to study politics in new and kind of innovative ways. And it supports research on the creation of open source tools. So these are like free software packages that can be used by anyone to try to do the kinds of research and work that we're doing. So to try to encourage other people to be able to do this research by lowering the cost of entry to it. And in the last 6 or 7 years, I've spent a ton of time researching social media and politics and researching lots of topics in there, ranging from how social media impacts protest behavior to whether being on social media increases one's knowledge or decreases one's knowledge about politics, to the relationship between offline violence in the Middle East and online anti-Shia hate speech, for example, in Saudi Arabia, to looking at the role of networks in Egypt and what effect that has on people's tolerance. If they're in more diverse networks, are they more likely to have more tolerant speech? And then a lot of things on what's been happening in the United States recently as well. So we've done work on hate speech and fake news and disinformation online. So I've gotten very involved in those questions. It's interesting though, because even though when I first started, this had to do with, I got interested in about a particular protest in Russia, Russia has come sort of full circle back into the study of social media and politics in the aftermath of the 2016 elections, when there's been a ton of claims made about Russian attempts to interfere in the US 2016 elections, as well as now Russia's attempt to sort of weaponize social media and use it as a tool of foreign policy in elections around the world. So even though in some ways my research took a turn that broadened it beyond the post-communist context, Russia has sort of pulled me back into studying Russian involvement. Although whereas I previously was more interested in Russian domestic politics, this has pulled me back into sort of Russia's role in the international environment. And I spend a lot of time at conferences where people are interested in sort of the relationship between social media, disinformation, and political polarization. And there's always sort of a healthy role for Russia in there. The other thing is that in this lab, one of the big things we also got interested in was how authoritarian regimes respond to online opposition, or how competitive authoritarian regimes respond to online opposition. And as a result of that, I started about 5 years ago a project with at that point a couple of PhD students in the politics department and in the SMAP lab, but who were both also Russians and who were both also active in the Jordan Center as graduate students while they were here, Denis Stukal and Sergei Sanovich. And we began studying the role, how Russia was responding to online opposition, and that took us into a project on bots in Russian politics. So we actually started studying Russian bots back in 2000. We actually started studying Russian bots back in 2013, way before anyone in the United States was talking about Russian bots. Not because we were interested in US politics, but because we were interested in Russian politics. And so we worked with a large team of undergraduate students in Moscow to sort of build up technology to be able to identify Russian bots, or bots that tweeted in Russian, in the Russian political Twitter sphere. So we've had a project ongoing about that for years now too. One of the more striking things that we learned was that fake news was more likely to have been shared on Facebook way more likely to have been shared on Facebook by people who were over age 65 than it was by millennials. And I think part of the reason when you ask, like, what's the most, so you're nodding your head in the sense that, like, maybe surprising is not the most interesting thing about it, but if you think about the beginning of the discussion of sort of the fake news debate, right, what was the one policy response everybody was talking about? Was digital literacy classes in high schools, that you should go around to high schools and educate kids about digital literacy. And there was a sense that the millennials are completely different because they're getting all their news from online, so if there's a problem with fake news online, right, this has got to be at the root of the millennials. And then so to find that this actually was not the case in this study we did was really kind of illuminating and interesting. And moreover, what was important about it was we only were able to carry out this study by accident because we happened to have the right study that was in the field at the time of the 2016 elections. We were running a survey over the course of the 2016 elections, and we had asked people who were participating in that survey, would they be willing to share their data with us from Facebook? And we had no idea whether they were going to be willing to do this or not. But it turned out that 50% of the people who we shared our data, who we invited, who had a Facebook account in our survey, so about 80% of our survey reported being on Facebook, of that 80%, half of them were willing to share their data with us. So in the aftermath of the election, and all of a sudden everyone was talking about this fake news or disinformation phenomenon, we realized we had the data to be able to go and look at who was actually sharing fake news online. Now, probably Facebook knew about this, but it had not gotten into the public discourse. And it's possible that Facebook didn't know about this because we showed this research to Facebook, and in the aftermath, I believe Facebook has definitely looked into it. But so that's been really a kind of interesting experience as a scholar. And when that article came out about people sharing fake news, that it was the over 65s who, as it turned out on average, shared 7 times as many links to fake news websites as millennials, that news kind of spread around the globe very quickly and had received much more sort of coverage in the press than any research I had ever done or we had ever done before that. And so it was an interesting phenomenon, sort of watching that and being part of injecting into the public understanding of this kind of new world of digital media and politics, injecting into that understanding something sort of novel about it. To bring it back to Russia, I'll give you one other sort of Russia-related study information that we found that was quite surprising to us. Twitter, in the aftermath of the 2016 election, released a data set of all the tweets. Well, first they released the name of about 3,000 Twitter accounts that Twitter had ascertained were controlled by the Russian Internet Research Agency. And so we were then able to go into collections of data that we had from the 2016 election and look and see if we could find tweets that were tweeted by these Russian troll accounts. We did that, and we then looked at the links that these Russian accounts had shared, so hyperlinks to other websites, and in particular to news websites. And what we found, again, surprised us. We went and looked, like, were they sharing a lot of fake news or what people call junk news or hyperpartisan news? And yes, we did find they shared that, and they shared more than sort of our average politically interested US Twitter users, but not a lot more. And it turned out that only 6% of the links that they were sharing were to these junk news sites as compared to 4% from a random sample of sort of politically interested US Twitter users. But what they were sharing in much higher quantities was links to local news websites. So they shared, I think it was 15 times as many links to local news websites as our politically interested Twitter users, but we also just a random sample of US Twitter users, and the Russian trolls shared 90 times as many links to local news sites, so sites like NewJersey.com. And so that was kind of surprising. We weren't expecting to find that. I mean, we went looking to see what the case was, but we weren't expecting to find that. And it did, suggest a degree of sophistication, because it turns out Americans trust local news sources more than they trust national news sources. So maybe it suggested a kind of degree of sophistication. One of the things that's amazing about, and also frustrating about studying social media and politics, is that unlike the study of history, where history doesn't really change much, maybe there's a new discovery of an archive, maybe there's a new interpretation, but what we're trying to study now is changing really, really fast. And honestly, even in comparison to sort of what I have done in political science before, and studying the post-communist world was a world that changed really, really fast. I mean, in 1980 and 1990, you thought communists were finished, and then 93, 94, ex-communist parties win all these elections in Poland and Hungary and Lithuania. So that kind of got me used to things changing quickly, but even by those standards, the way the world changes when you're thinking about the digitization of politics, right, and the role of digital media and the role that social media is playing in politics. I mean, if we were sitting here in the fall of 2016, or the summer of 2016, there's no way we would be talking about fake news and fake news impact on the political system, right? We wouldn't be talking about sort of Russia's weaponization of social media. Like, no one was talking about those things. That was only 3 years ago. So when you ask to sort of look in the future, what you're going to be doing in 3 years, logistically, in some ways, I can't tell you exactly what we're going to be studying in the next 3 years, but I can tell you the genre that we're going to be studying it in, right? We're really interested, going forward, we're really interested in understanding how people learn information about politics in this digital era, and that's going to keep changing, but the question is going to remain, and it's, in some ways it's going to make the question even more important, because even if you get it settled at one point in time, you've got to keep asking because it keeps changing. We're particularly interested in understanding the sort of malicious actors that are present in democracies that utilize social media, so these kind of phenomenons like hate speech and foreign interference and disinformation. And we're also really, really interested in this relationship between democracy, democratization, and social media, right? How can social media be both liberation technology, and can democracy survive the internet? And in the final thing that we are interested in, will continue to be interested in, is how do non-democratic regimes around the world adapt to the evolving possibility of opposition online? And we are seeing, again, we've gone in whipsaw fashion from where, in 2011, and it seemed like social media was going to, be a huge, challenge to authoritarian regimes around the country. You're seeing all sorts of different ways that different regimes around the world, all sorts of different ways that different regimes around the world have responded to this challenge. And you have the Chinese model, and you have the Russian model, you have the Iranians turning off the internet, as we're in the days preceding this interview. So that question too, how to regime. So social media, digital media, has become sort of very, very closely intertwined with politics in ways that we could never foreseen before. We're going to keep trying to study those things in the future, but how we're going to do it, and what questions we're going to be asking, that's going to be in some ways dictated by the evolution of politics in the world.